As Henry Clay was debating a comprehensive program of federal subsidies for internal improvements, another plank of the American system was thrust to the forefront. It was the formation of a national bank. A national bank was a key part of the system because it would facilitate the issuing of government debt. In other words, it would help the government borrow money. This money could then be used to finance internal improvement projects. Alexander Hamilton originally proposed the concept of a national bank in 1790. However, in response to Hamilton's proposed bank, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison raised strong objections as to its constitutionality. In their opinion, the Constitution did not allow the federal government the power to grant incorporation to a private bank. In spite of their criticisms, the bank bill passed both houses of Congress. President Washington signed the bill, and thus on February 25, 1791, the first Bank of the United States was established with a 20-year charter. In 1811, after the charter of the First Bank of the United States expired, there was an effort to recharter the bank. During the debate, Henry Clay, then a senator from Kentucky, expressed the view that the federal law establishing a national bank was unconstitutional. In an 1811 Senate speech, he said, "I felt myself bound to obey the paramount duties I owe my country and its Constitution, to make one effort, however feeble, to avert the passage of what appears to me a most unjustifiable law." He also called the power to incorporate a bank by the federal government a vagrant law. He went on, "What is the nature of this government? It is emphatically federal, vested with an aggregate of specified powers for general purposes, conceded by existing sovereignties, who have themselves retained what is not so conceded. It is said that there are cases in which it must act on implied powers. This is not controverted, but the implication must be necessary and obviously flow from the enumerated power with which it is allied. The power to charter companies is not specified in the grant." Surprisingly, Clay begins by sounding very much like a strict constructionist of the Constitution and a states' rights advocate. He then makes it clear that he is in agreement with Jefferson and Madison concerning a national bank. The power to establish a bank was not constitutional because there was no enumerated power to justify the bank. At the time, it seems the majority agreed with Clay, as the bank was not rechartered. Following the War of 1812, the nation's fiscal circumstances changed, as would Henry Clay's view of a national bank. The nation found its monetary system to be in a particularly precarious position. Private banks were allowed to print their own notes, which were not necessarily redeemable in specie. Since these notes did not have to be redeemed in silver or gold, there was little restraint on the number of notes printed, and thus the money supply expanded wildly. Sound banks, usually those whose notes were redeemable in specie, began refusing to accept notes issued by unsound banks. This caused enormous uncertainty in trade and business. Two ways of dealing with this problem were considered. The old Republican anti-federalist path was to have the federal and state governments force inflationary reckless banks to redeem their notes in specie. When these banks failed to do so, they would be liquidated and their notes forced out of circulation. This would return the economy to a sound money footing. The old Federalists, however, advocated a different path. They argued for a central bank modeled closely after the First Bank of the United States. A majority in Congress agreed with the second plan, and the Second Bank of the United States was created in 1816. Henry Clay, at the time Speaker of the House of Representatives, now believed the bank to be constitutional and voted for it. He explained his reversal of opinion in an 1832 speech. The power to establish a bank is deduced from that clause of the Constitution which confers on Congress all powers necessary and proper to carry into effect the enumerated powers. In 1811, I believed a Bank of the United States not necessary, and that a safe reliance might be placed on the local banks in the administration of the fiscal affairs of the government. The war taught us many lessons, and among others, demonstrated the necessity of a Bank of the United States to the successful operations of the government. In that speech, Clay said a national bank was necessary, but he never stated which enumerated power made it constitutional. If it were previously unconstitutional, an amendment would have had to be passed to make it constitutional. Perceived necessity does not make something constitutional. Since the United States survived from 1832 to 1913 without a national bank, one has to wonder how necessary a bank really was for carrying out constitutional powers. Nonetheless, the second plank of the American system was now in place. The Second Bank of the United States was established as a private corporation with 20% of its stock owned by the federal government. The bank's official mandate was to create a sound economy by the following means. First, create a uniform national paper currency. Second, purchase a large part of the public debt. Third, receive deposits of Treasury funds. And fourth, require Bank of the United States notes and deposits to be redeemable in specie. The bank started operations in January 1817. On the surface, it may seem that the Second Bank of the United States was a pretty good idea. However, soon after it started operations, the bank began to massively inflate the money supply. Senator William H. Wells, Federalist from Delaware, noted that this bill came out of the hands of the administration ostensibly for the purpose of correcting the diseased state of our paper currency by restraining and curtailing the overissue of banking paper. And yet it came prepared to inflict upon us the same evil, being itself nothing more than simply a paper-making machine. During 1817 and 1818, its specie never rose above $2.5 million. However, its loans totaled $21.8 million. Thus, in a mere year and a half of operation, the Bank of the United States added a net of $19.3 million to the money supply. The abundance of cheap credit fostered an economic boom and created a real estate bubble that sharply raised property values around the country. However, beginning in the summer of 1818, the Bank of the United States became aware of the dangerous inflationary climate that was emerging. In response, it proceeded to engage in a series of deflationary moves. This led to a wave of bankruptcies throughout the country, a collapse of real estate prices, and subsequently the Panic of 1819. An economic depression ensued that lasted until 1821. William M. Gouge, Jacksonian hard money economist and historian, stated, "By its precipitate and dramatic contraction, the bank was saved and the people were ruined." As the country was reeling from the severe economic decline, there were charges of extensive fraud at the bank's Baltimore branch. It would surface later that the officers had looted almost $1 million from the bank. Indiana and Illinois in 1816 and 1818 respectively amended their state constitutions to prohibit the Bank of the United States from operating there. North Carolina, Georgia, Maryland, Tennessee, and Kentucky imposed heavy taxes on Bank of the United States branches. In 1818, the state of Maryland proceeded to impose a tax on the Baltimore branch of the bank. Maryland's intention was to tax the bank out of existence, at least in Maryland. James McCulloch, head of the branch, refused to pay the tax. Maryland sued for collection of the debt. McCulloch responded that the tax was unconstitutional. Eventually, the Maryland Court of Appeals sided with Maryland. McCulloch then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which reviewed the case in 1819. In the landmark Supreme Court case of McCulloch v. Maryland, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of McCulloch and the National Bank. Chief Justice John Marshall, in his opinion, cited the Necessary and Proper Clause in the Constitution as justification for the power to establish the bank. How did Marshall's opinion play out practically at the time? In February 1819, while McCulloch v. Maryland was before the United States Supreme Court, the state of Ohio imposed a $50,000 tax on each of the Bank of the United States branches within the state. Ohio sent a deputy to collect the tax, by persuasion if he could, but by violence if he must. When the deputy was denied payment by the bank's management, he leapt over the counter, strode into the bank vaults, and helped himself to $100,000 in paper and specie. The Bank of the United States sued the deputies and the state of Ohio, relying on Marshall's opinion. The Ohio State Legislature responded by refusing to comply with the court's decision. We are aware of the doctrine that the federal courts are exclusively vested with jurisdiction to declare, in the last resort, the true interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. To this doctrine, we can never give our assent. The Ohio legislature's opinion was that the Supreme Court's decision was wrong, and it did not have the final say on the interpretation of the Constitution. Ohio, therefore, did not have to comply. In 1819, the opinion of the Supreme Court did not necessarily carry more weight than the opinions of the President, the Congress, or the citizens of states. For the supporters of the American system, their bank problems would continue. Economist Murray Rothbard comments, Out of the bitter experiences of the Panic of 1819 emerged the beginnings of the Jacksonian movement, dedicated to hard money, the eradication of fractional reserve banking in general, and the Bank of the United States in particular. The leaders of the movement, Rothbard mentioned, consisted of Andrew Jackson himself, Senator Thomas Hart Old Bullion Benton of Missouri, and future President James K. Polk of Tennessee. It appears the Jacksonians were ardent hard money advocates of the Ricardian currency school. British economist David Ricardo believed banks should be backed by 100% bullion reserves. Ricardo observed in the Bank of England that a lack of 100% reserves led to an inflation of the money supply and a depreciation in the value of the currency. The Democratic Party's monetary policy was a shift away from inflationary paper money and fractional reserve banking to pure specie and banks confined to 100% reserves. Rothbard suggested the Democrats had a coherent plan on banking. The first important step was to abolish central banking. In the Jacksonian view, this was the major inflationary culprit. Then they would proceed to the state level. Jackson had previously shown his willingness to shut down a state-sponsored bank in Tennessee. This plan spelled disaster to Henry Clay and the adherents of the American system. With his ascendancy to the presidency in 1829, Jackson had already destroyed the American system's adherents' dream of a federally subsidized policy of internal improvements. He now set his sights on the Second Bank of the United States. Jackson denounced the bank in his first annual message in 1829. Both the constitutionality and the expediency of the law creating this bank are well questioned by a large portion of our fellow citizens, and it must be admitted by all that it has failed in the great end of establishing an uniform and sound currency. In Jackson's opinion, the bank was unconstitutional. He also reminds his listeners that the concept of a national bank is a bad idea by alluding to the damage done to the economy by the bank in 1819. Henry Clay and his allies were aware of Jackson's position on the bank and now sought some political way to salvage the bank. In 1832, Clay thought he had found it. Under the advice of Clay, Nicholas Biddle, president of the bank, was persuaded to seek a congressional recharter of the bank even though the charter was not up until 1836. Clay calculated that Jackson would not issue a veto since it would possibly hurt his chances of re-election. If Jackson did veto the bank bill, Clay could then use the issue to his advantage in his campaign for the presidency. If he won, he could then save the bank. Jackson perceived the intentions of Clay and other members of the Whig Party. He told his vice president, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." The Recharter bill passed Congress, and on July 10th, Jackson subsequently vetoed it. He wrote, "It is maintained by the advocates of the bank that its constitutionality in all its features ought to be considered as settled by precedent and by the decision of the Supreme Court. To this conclusion I cannot assent. Mere precedent is a dangerous source of authority, and should not be regarded as deciding questions of constitutional power except where the acquiescence of the people and the states can be considered as well settled." Jackson here is alluding to the McCulloch v. Maryland decision. His opinion was that if the states did not agree with the Supreme Court's opinion, then it was just that, an opinion, and not law. He continued, "The opinion of the judges has no more authority over Congress than the opinion of Congress has over the judges, and on that point the President is independent of both. The authority of the Supreme Court must not, therefore, be permitted to control the Congress or the Executive when acting in their legislative capacities, but to have only such influence as the force of their reasoning may deserve." Jackson believed that because of the separation of powers, the Supreme Court had no authority to force Congress or the President to do anything. Jackson's veto was not overturned. In 1832, Jackson was re-elected on the bank issue. He polled more than 54% of the popular vote and almost 5 times as many electoral votes as Clay. Clay's gambit backfired. With this mandate, Jackson lost no time in disestablishing the Bank of the United States as a central bank. The critical action came in 1833 when Jackson removed the public treasury deposits from the bank and placed them in a number of state-chartered banks throughout the country. In 1836, the bank's charter expired, and the bank eventually went bankrupt. Jackson had indeed killed the bank, as well as the second plank of Henry Clay's American system.